The morning of Tuesday, November 19th, 1963, broke cool and bright over Dallas, a city already crackling with anticipation and dread. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy had come south to heal a widening rift between the new frontier and the rising Sunbelt conservatism that labeled him in leaflets scattered along Main Street, nothing short of a traitor to the Republic. Jacqueline Kennedy, elegant even in the exhausting final trimester of pregnancy, stepped off Air Force Two in a pink Chanel suit, the color already becoming her signature, and greeted Governor John Bowdoin Connolly Jr. and his wife Nellie with the practiced warmth of a woman who understood that every handshake was a political transaction. Connolly, once a protege of Lyndon Johnson and now a man with presidential ambitions of his own, had fought for this visit, believing a grateful Texas could still love the Kennedys, if only they could see the couple in the flesh. Across town, in a cheap rooming house on North Beckley Avenue, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald folded a blanket over his Mannlicher Carcano rifle and told his landlady he would not be home for lunch. He had drifted back from the Soviet Union the previous year, carrying Marxist pamphlets and a simmering resentment that no one in Dallas seemed to notice his grand ideological struggle. That same dawn, a short, stocky nightclub owner named Jack Ruby paced the floor of his Carousel Club on Commerce Street, nursing grievances against local critics and already rehearsing the explosive tirades that would soon make him infamous. Down Elm Street, in the shadow of the red-brick Texas School Book Depository, dress manufacturer Abraham Zapruder balanced a new 8mm Bell & Howell camera on his shoulder and rehearsed the panoramic sweep he hoped would capture the presidential motorcade for his grandchildren. He had chosen a concrete pergola on the Grassy Knoll because it offered an unobstructed view of the turn from Houston onto Elm, a modest civic decision about where to stand that would soon place him at the center of every conspiracy theory for the next 60 years. Dallas itself felt schizophrenic that morning. Adoring housewives clutched hand-painted signs reading, "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy," while just blocks away, the John Birch Society plastered telephone poles with posters branding the president a communist appeaser. Secret Service agent Winston Lawson reviewed the finalized route one last time, tracing the neat blue line that would carry the Lincoln Continental convertible west on Main, right on Houston, then left on Elm, passing beneath the triple underpass before emerging onto the Stemmons Freeway. No one, not Lawson, not Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry, not even the meticulous Zapruder, understood that this ordinary choice of streets would soon be studied, frame by frame, by a grieving nation. Governor Connolly, riding in the jump seat ahead of the Kennedys, rehearsed the gracious welcome he would offer as they rolled past the crowd, unaware that in fewer than 48 hours his own blood would mingle with the president's on the pink wool of Jackie's suit. And somewhere in the shadows of the depository, Oswald tucked 3 copper-jacketed cartridges into the magazine of his Italian rifle, the final pieces of a puzzle that would never quite fit together. The Motorcade, 12:30 p.m. Friday, November 22nd, 1963, 12:28 p.m. Central Standard Time. The midnight blue Lincoln Continental glides west on Main Street, its chrome grille flashing like a mirror. Governor John Connolly sits forward on the jump seat, right hand lifted in the easy rhythm of 1,000 campaign parades. Behind them, President Kennedy settles into the back seat, tan suit crisp, hair copper bright in the noon glare. The motorcycle escort, 4 Harley-Davidsons, throbs like rolling thunder, engines syncopated with the clatter of applause. Radio chatter crackles from the lead car. 5 minutes to the Trade Mart. At 12:29, the motorcade eases onto Houston Street, then swings sharp left toward the thin canyon of Elm. The crowd thins here. Office workers lean from windows above the Texas School Book Depository. In Abraham Zapruder's hands, a Bell & Howell 8mm camera clicks, 18 frames per second, capturing light the way a net catches minnows. Inside the Lincoln, Jackie Kennedy touches the rose bouquet in her lap, petals already wilting in the 90-degree heat. Governor Connolly turns his head right, calling out to the president, "Mr. Kennedy, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." The president starts to answer, when the first sharp crack splits the air like a board snapped over a knee. The sound is flat, almost anticlimactic, swallowed by the roar of engines and the wind. Zapruder's camera keeps rolling, each frame a frozen slice of time. Frame 152, 153, the president's hands rise toward his throat, elbows lifted as if adjusting a collar that has suddenly grown too tight. Governor Connolly feels the air change, a pressure drop, like the moment before a Texas storm. A second crack follows, closer, metallic, ricocheting off the limestone walls of the underpass. Nellie Connolly lunges sideways, instinct pulling her husband downward. The Lincoln, codenamed SS-100X, slows almost imperceptibly. Driver Bill Greer glances in the rearview mirror. Jackie leans toward her husband, voice lost in the sudden acoustics of panic. Zapruder's finger stays on the trigger, the camera clicking like a mechanical heartbeat. Frame 223, the third and final shot. The sound is wet, intimate, echoing inside the open car like a thunderclap in a closet. The motorcade is still moving, 12 miles per hour, yet time itself seems to pause, balanced on the razor edge between before and after. At 12:30 and 6 seconds, the bubble topless Lincoln carries its wounded cargo beneath the shadow of the triple underpass, and the world begins its long, irreversible tilt toward November grief. The clock in Dealey Plaza reads 12:30 and 1 second when the first rifle crack splits the autumn air. Lee Harvey Oswald has already worked the bolt action once, chambering the next round with mechanical precision. His Mannlicher Carcano rifle, purchased for $19.95 through mail order, rests steady on the cardboard boxes he arranged like sandbags. At 12:30 and 3 seconds, the second shot tears through the presidential limousine. The bullet enters Kennedy's upper back, exits his throat just above the knot of his dark blue tie, then continues its impossible journey. Governor John Connolly feels the impact as the same projectile slams into his right back, shattering his fifth rib and exiting his chest. Abraham Zapruder keeps filming, his Bell & Howell 8mm camera capturing history at 18 frames per second. In frame 223, Kennedy's hands move toward his throat and the universal gesture of choking. 3 frames later, Connolly's face contorts in shock as the bullet that has already wounded the president finds its second victim. The third and final shot comes at 12:30 and 8 seconds. This bullet enters the right rear of Kennedy's skull and exits the right front, creating the fatal wound that would haunt America forever. Jacqueline Kennedy climbs onto the trunk of the moving car, reaching for fragments of her husband's skull. Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called magic bullet, is found hours later on Connolly's stretcher at Parkland Hospital. The nearly pristine projectile shows only minor flattening at its base, raising immediate questions about how it could have caused 7 wounds in 2 men while remaining intact. Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the attending physicians, would later testify that the throat wound appeared to be an entrance wound, contradicting the single bullet theory. Eyewitnesses begin speaking of shots from the Grassy Knoll, a small hill topped with picket fences to the right front of the motorcade. Abraham Zapruder himself would insist he heard shots from behind him, consistent with the book depository, but others swear by different memories. Jean Hill, the lady in red who stood closest to the presidential limousine, maintains she saw a puff of smoke from the Knoll area. The Warren Commission, appointed by President Johnson 7 days later, would spend 10 months constructing the single bullet theory to explain the wounds. Their reconstruction requires bullet 392 have traveled downward at 17 degrees, entered Kennedy's back, exited his throat, entered Connolly's back, exited his chest, shattered his wrist, and embedded in his thigh. Yet the bullet itself shows only 99% of its original weight remaining, with no visible deformation that would account for such devastation. From Parkland Hospital's trauma room to the Bethesda naval autopsy, the wounds would become the center of a controversy that refuses to die. The doctors who treated Kennedy at Parkland describe a massive exit wound at the back of the head, while the autopsy photographs show something different. These discrepancies, these whispers of conspiracy, begin their long journey from emergency room to national obsession, carried forward by men like New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who would launch his own investigation 4 years later. The hunt began before the blood on Elm Street had dried. Patrolman Marion Baker, pistol drawn, burst into the book depository's second-floor lunchroom 90 seconds after the final shot, confronting a calm young man drinking a Coca-Cola. Lee Harvey Oswald's hands were steady, his breathing normal. "This it is?" he asked, as Baker's revolver pressed against his ribs. By 1:15, Oswald had slipped out the building's front door, boarded a city bus, then a taxi, arriving at his rooming house on Beckley Avenue, where he retrieved a pistol wrapped in a brown paper bag. His landlady, Earlene Roberts, watched him zip up a jacket and bolt out the door, muttering something she couldn't quite catch. The trail went cold for 35 minutes. Then, at 1:45, shoe store manager Johnny Brewer noticed a suspicious man lurking in the recessed doorway of Hardy's shoe store, glancing repeatedly toward the street where police cars screamed past. Brewer followed the man half a block to the Texas Theater on West Jefferson Boulevard, where the fugitive ducked inside without paying. The theater was screening War is Hell, a Korean War drama, to a sparse Sunday afternoon crowd. Oswald settled into the third row from the back, his right hand resting ominously inside his jacket. At 1:50, the house lights blazed on as Dallas police flooded the aisles. "Well, it's all over now," Oswald muttered, punching Officer Nick McDonald in the face before 6 men wrestled him to the floor, a snub-nosed .38 revolver clattering across the worn carpet. By evening, Dallas Police Headquarters became a 3-ring circus. Oswald, handcuffed and bruised, faced the cameras with unsettling composure. "I'm just a patsy," he told the assembled press, his voice carrying a strange detachment that would echo through history. Chief Jesse Curry announced charges for both the Kennedy assassination and the murder of patrolman J.D. Tippit, while conspiracy theories already began their poisonous bloom. The weekend unfolded like a fever dream. Oswald was moved repeatedly through the building's bowels, paraded past photographers and staged perp walks that violated every protocol. His mother, Marguerite, arrived demanding to see her son, while his wife, Marina, 22 and Russian-born, sat in a separate room, answering questions through an interpreter. Sunday morning, November 24th, brought an autumn chill and an execution. Jack Ruby, a 39-year-old nightclub owner who ran the Carousel Club downtown, had spent the previous 2 nights among the crowds, his tan trench coat concealing a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver. At 11:21, as Oswald emerged flanked by detectives, Ruby stepped forward from a cluster of reporters like a figure emerging from shadows. The pistol rose in a smooth arc, a perfect choreography of violence performed for the cameras. The single shot echoed off concrete walls as Oswald crumpled, clutching his abdomen, his face contorted in shock and pain. 60 million Americans watched live as Ruby was tackled, the revolver spinning across the floor. "Jack, you son of a bitch!" someone screamed, while in living rooms across the nation, families sat transfixed by the first televised murder in history. Oswald died at 1:07 that afternoon at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same building where Kennedy had been pronounced dead 48 hours earlier. The man who might have answered the nation's burning questions took his secrets to the grave, while Ruby himself became the first piece of evidence in the conspiracy theories that would haunt America for generations. 3 days after Thanksgiving, in the shadow of a national funeral still fresh in every American heart, President Lyndon Johnson picked up a beige telephone in the Oval Office and asked Chief Justice Earl Warren to come to the White House. When Warren arrived at 4:30 that afternoon, Johnson's eyes were red, his voice gravel, and he told the most respected judge in the land that only a blue-ribbon commission could quiet the rumors already crackling across kitchen tables and newsrooms. Warren resisted at first, arguing that courts, not commissions, decide guilt. But Johnson leaned closer and said the ghost of Dallas would stalk every successor unless the truth was nailed down like a coffin lid. Reluctantly, the Chief Justice accepted, and on December 1st, 1963, the President signed Executive Order 11,130, creating the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. 7 men answered the call. They hired 14 lawyers, borrowed 130 staffers from the FBI and CIA, and rented the Veterans of Foreign Wars building on Vermont Avenue as their war room. From the first week, the staff felt the weight of a nation breathing down their necks. They flew witnesses in on military jets, locked them in soundproof rooms, and swore them to secrecy with threats of contempt. Abraham Zapruder was summoned from Dallas, his 8mm camera cradled like a holy relic, and frame by frame, they counted the seconds between life and death. In February, they returned to Dealey Plaza, cordoned off the streets, and rebuilt the motorcade with Secret Service stand-ins and a Lincoln convertible identical to the death car. They fired test shots from the 6th-floor window, measured angles with surveyors' transits, and planted orange cones where fragments were found. Inside the commission, a civil war broke out over what the lawyers privately called the single bullet theory. Junior counsel Arlen Specter, a 33-year-old former prosecutor from Philadelphia, argued that one missile had pierced Kennedy's throat, exited his neck, then smashed Governor Connolly's ribs and wrist before embedding shallowly in the governor's thigh. Senior staffers called it impossible, demanded more tests, and wrote furious memos warning that the public would laugh at such a tidy explanation. Yet Warren, haunted by the memory of Mrs. Connolly's reluctance, bore Kennedy's whispered plea to spare her more pain, pressed for unity. On September 24, 1964, 888 pages bound in blue cloth were delivered to the White House and to every newsroom in America. The verdict was stark. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy, domestic or foreign. The single bullet accounted for every wound. But even before the ink dried, dissent began to seep through the cracks. Junior counsel David Bellin wrote a secret memo, never published, saying the evidence for the single bullet was thin ice over deep water. Within weeks, underground presses in New Orleans and Los Angeles churned out the first conspiracy zines, claiming 3, 4, even 6 gunmen. District Attorney Jim Garrison in New Orleans opened his own file, certain the plot reached into the heart of the CIA. And so the Warren Report, meant to close the book on national trauma, instead became the first chapter in a never-ending mystery. The questions that Johnson hoped to bury rose again like ghosts, and the magic bullet that was supposed to explain everything became, in the public mind, the very proof that nothing was as it seemed. 3 years after the Warren Report tried to nail the coffin shut on the Kennedy assassination, a rumpled prosecutor in New Orleans stood ready to pry it open again. Jim Garrison, a bear of a man with a taste for poetry and headlines, had never quite swallowed the official story. On March 1, 1967, he strode before television cameras and announced the arrest of Clay Shaw, a respected local businessman and former director of the International Trade Mart. The charge was conspiracy to murder the President of the United States. Shaw, a silver-haired preservationist who had helped restore the French Quarter, seemed an unlikely plotter. But Garrison claimed Shaw was the mysterious Clay Bertrand, who had called attorney Dean Andrews after the assassination, arranging legal help for Lee Harvey Oswald. The district attorney's star witness was a 25-year-old insurance salesman named Perry Russo. Russo swore he had attended a party at David Ferry's apartment, where Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald discussed killing Kennedy. Ferry, a former airline pilot and anti-Castro activist, had died mysteriously in February, leaving behind a trail of conspiracy theories. As Garrison's investigation expanded, his methods grew increasingly theatrical. He subpoenaed everyone from actresses to mafia figures, claiming the CIA and anti-Castro Cubans had orchestrated the plot. The national media descended on New Orleans like locusts. Walter Cronkite called Garrison's case a dangerous fantasy. Life magazine ran a scathing cover story, The Incredible Case of Jim Garrison. Undeterred, Garrison pressed forward. The trial began on January 29, 1969. For 34 days, the courtroom became a surreal theater of the absurd. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Evidence evaporated under scrutiny. Garrison's own investigators began to doubt their findings. Yet through it all, Shaw maintained his dignity. On March 1, 1969, exactly 2 years after his arrest, the jury delivered its verdict. Not guilty. The trial had lasted 34 days and cost the state of Louisiana over $1 million. But something fundamental had changed. The assassination was no longer just a tragedy. It was a cultural obsession. Hollywood took notice. The seeds Garrison planted would bloom into Oliver Stone's JFK 2 decades later. But for now, in 1969, Jim Garrison walked out of the courthouse defeated, yet defiant. He had lost the case, but won something larger. The Warren Report would never again go unchallenged. The magic bullet had shattered into 1,000 questions that would haunt America forever. And Clay Shaw, acquitted but forever marked, would die in 1974, still protesting his innocence. The conspiracy theories, once whispered in dark corners, had found their voice, and they would never, ever be silenced. 16 years after the echo of 3 shots cracked across Dealey Plaza, the United States Congress stepped back into the shadow of that day. The House Select Committee on Assassinations convened in 1976, sworn to exhume every whisper, every silence. Chairman Louis Stokes, a former prosecutor from Ohio, opened the first public session with the sound of a dictabelt recording. The tape had been captured by a motorcycle patrolman's stuck microphone, a ghost of radio static that might, or might not, hold extra gunshots. Acoustics experts hunched over oscilloscopes, tracing spikes and valleys. Their testimony chilled the chamber. A fourth shot, they claimed, came from the Grassy Knoll. Ballistics teams refired Oswald's Carcano rifle in an underground range beneath the Capitol. They measured copper traces, compared grooves, and shook their heads. In September 1979, the committee filed its final report. Their words detonated across the nation. President Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. The Warren Commission's single bullet theory, once the official gospel, now bled doubt from every pore. Television networks replayed the Zapruder film in slow motion, framed 225 frozen as Kennedy's head snapped backward. The public did not merely question, it hungered for the hidden. Then, in 1991, Oliver Stone's film JFK stormed theaters. Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison thundered that the truth had been buried. Lines wrapped around blocks. Congress felt the heat. Senator John Glenn, once an astronaut, argued that secrecy corroded democracy itself. On October 26, 1992, President George Herbert Walker Bush signed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. The law ordered every scrap, memos, photos, dictabelts, into the National Archives by 2017. Midnight trucks delivered boxes labeled classified. Archivists in cotton gloves lifted yellowed teletypes. Redactors hovered over pages with black markers. Microfilm readers whirred like distant cicadas. Each release sparked fresh headlines. Conspiracy authors camped outside the archives. By 2013, 5 million pages were online, yet thousands remained withheld for national security. The 2017 deadline approached like a distant storm. President Donald Trump tweeted he would allow long blocked files to be opened. At 12:01 a.m. on October 26, 2017, servers flickered. Journalists pounced on newly released CIA cables, but thousands of pages still carried black bars. The echo never fades. The records may age, but suspicion remains evergreen. The assassination of President Kennedy lives on, not just in history books, but in the restless American imagination, forever asking who else stood on the grassy knoll. Today, Dealey Plaza feels almost gentle. Children chase pigeons across the white X painted on Elm Street. A street preacher waves faded pamphlets about the single bullet that supposedly did impossible things. Up on the 6th floor of the former Texas School Book Depository, now the 6th floor museum, visitors press foreheads to glass. They stand where Lee Harvey Oswald crouched behind boxes of textbooks on November 22, 1963. Through that same window, they see the curve of Elm Street, the pergola where Abraham Zapruder filmed, the grassy knoll where doubt took root. Every day, digital detectives arrive with laser pointers and smartphone apps. They trace imaginary lines from window to pavement, arguing over angles measured to the inch. The Warren Commission said one bullet zigzagged through President Kennedy's neck, then Governor John Connally's chest and wrist, emerging nearly pristine. But here on the ground, that story still feels impossible. Mary Woodward, now 87, returns each anniversary. She was 24 when she watched the motorcade, saw the president's head snap back and to the left. Back and to the left, she whispers to a teenager filming for TikTok. The conspiracy hawkers know their lines by heart. They sell maps showing 3, 4, sometimes 5 shooters. The grassy knoll fence remains their favorite villain. Every shadow there could hide a second gunman. Every puff of smoke from a train yard becomes evidence. Jack Ruby's nightclub, the Carousel, is long gone, but Ruby's 2 bullets into Oswald's gut still echo through American justice. Without a trial, without testimony, the case froze forever in that basement. At Arlington National Cemetery, the eternal flame burns regardless of theories. Jacqueline Kennedy lit it 3 days after Dallas, November 25, 1963. Every hour, tourists file past, some too young to remember Camelot. Back in Dealey Plaza, sunset paints the pergola gold. A tour guide finishes his spiel. Some say we'll never know. The elm trees, replanted after the originals died, now tower overhead. Pistoria has no last frame. Each generation reopens the wound, searching for meaning in a moment that changed everything. The records remain sealed until 2029, then 2039, then forever. Some fires never go out. They simply wait for the next generation to ask why.